Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Succinct Psychology, or as we like to call it, Succinct. My name is Jaia Hendrickson, and this video is going to be a continuation of my previous video covering Chapter 9 in Principles of Social Psychology, looking at helping and altruism. The negative emotions that we may experience when we're perceiving another person's distress have a big influence on our helping. In some cases, people feel rather sickened or disgusted by the victim of an emergency. For instance, when the person is seriously injured and bleeding. Personal distress refers to the negative emotions that we may experience when we view another person suffering. Because we feel so uncomfortable when we feel personal distress, we may simply leave the scene rather than stopping. In other cases, we may not feel so many negative emotions upon viewing another person in need, but rather more positive feelings of a close connection with the person who's suffering. When we really experience the pain and the needs of the other person, we say that we're feeling empathy for that person. Empathy refers to an affective response in which a person understands and even feels another person's distress and experiences events the same way the other person does. Empathy seems to be a biological aspect of human nature, an emotion that's an integral part of being a human being, and that's designed to help us help. Empathy allows us to quickly and automatically perceive and understand the emotional states of others and to regulate our behavior towards others in coordinated and cooperative ways. Empathy may also create other emotions, such as sympathy, compassion, and tenderness. You can well imagine that we're more likely to help someone when we're feeling empathy for them. In this case, we want to comfort and help the person or the victim of a car accident. We've seen that people may feel either positive or negative emotions when they see someone who needs help. They may help others in part for selfish reasons, for instance, to relieve their own negative feelings about the suffering of the other, or in part for truly altruistic reasons, because they're experiencing empathy for the distress of the other person. But which type of emotions lead us to help in which situations? Daniel Batson and his colleagues attempted to answer this question by finding out if the ability to easily leave the scene of the suffering might affect this. In the study, male and female college students watched another person of the same sex who they thought was working on a series of tasks in the next room. The person was actually a pre-recorded videotape, but the participants did not know this. The women were told that the person was named Elaine, and the men were told that the person was named Charlie. During the time that the students were watching, and as part of the experiment, the other person was also supposedly receiving some mild electric shocks. The students who were observing were randomly assigned to one of two experimental conditions. The students who were in the easy escape condition were told that although the person would be completing 10 shock trials, they only had to watch the first two, after which they had the choice to leave. The students in the difficult escape condition, on the other hand, were told that they had to watch all 10 of the shock trials. During the second trial, the person in the other room began to look as if he or she was experiencing some discomfort. As the participants continued to observe, the assistant administering the shocks to the person asked whether he or she was alright, and the person hesitantly said yes, but also asked if they could get a glass of water before continuing. During this break, the experimenter entered the observation room and gave the research participant a questionnaire. The questionnaire asked the participants to indicate the feelings he or she was experiencing at the moment, and the responses to these questions allowed the experimenter to determine whether the person was feeling more personal distress, if they indicated that they were primarily feeling alarmed, or upset, or disturbed, or distressed, or more empathy, if they indicated that they were primarily feeling sympathetic, or compassionate, or warm. Then, the experimenter pointed out to the research participant that the other person was feeling uncomfortable and asked if he or she was willing to change places and volunteer for a bit. The dependent measure in the research was the average number of trials that the participant agreed to take the place for Elaine or Charlie. And as you can see here in the figure, Batson and his team found a person-situation interaction effect, such that when the participants knew that they could leave relatively quickly, the easy escape condition, then the people who were feeling empathy helped, whereas those who were feeling distress did not. This makes sense because empathy involves a real concern for the other person, a concern that couldn't be reduced even by leaving the scene. On the other hand, when the participants knew that they were going to have to view all the trials, the difficult escape condition, The participants who felt distress were more likely to help than those who were feeling empathy. Batson and his colleagues interpreted this to mean that these people helped to avoid the feeling of negative emotions of personal distress, which they were certain to experience as they continued to watch the other person suffer the shocks. You might have heard of the unusual case of the killing of 28-year-old Catherine Kitty Genovese in New York City at about 3 a.m. on March 13th in 1964. Her attacker, Winston Moseley, stabbed and sexually assaulted her within a few yards of her apartment building in the boroughs of Queens. During the struggle with her assailant, Kitty cried out for help, but no one responded. The struggle continued, and Kitty actually escaped from Moseley before he caught her again and stabbed her several more times, at which point she died from her wounds, unfortunately. Two psychologists, Bibb Latané and John Darley, found themselves particularly interested in and concerned about the Kitty Genovese case. As they thought about the stories that they'd read about it, they considered the nature of emergency situations, such as this one. They realized that emergencies are unusual, and people frequently don't really know what to do when they encounter them. Furthermore, emergencies are potentially dangerous to the helper, and so it's pretty amazing that anyone helps at all during emergency situations. To better understand the process of helping in an emergency, Latané and Darley developed a model of helping that took into consideration the important role of the social situation. Their model, which is shown here in the figure, Latané and Darley's stages of helping, has been extensively studied in many studies, and there is substantial support for it. Latané and Darley thought that the first thing that had to happen in order for people to help was they had to actually notice the emergency. Now, this seems pretty obvious, but it turns out that the social situation has a big impact on noticing emergencies. Consider, for instance, people who live in a large city, such as New York, Bangkok, or Beijing. These cities are big, noisy, and crowded, so it seems like there's a million things going on at once. How could people living in such a city even notice, let alone respond to the needs of all the people around them? They're simply too overloaded by the stimuli in the city. Many studies have found that people who live in smaller and less dense rural towns are more likely to help than those who live in large, crowded cities. Although there are a lot of reasons for such differences, just noticing the emergency is critical. When there are more people around us, it's less likely that people notice the needs of others. And even if we notice the emergency, we might not interpret it as an actual emergency. The problem is that events are frequently ambiguous, and we have to interpret them to understand what they really mean. Furthermore, we often don't see the whole event unfolding, so it's difficult to get a good handle on it. Is a man holding an iPod running away from a crowd a criminal that needs to be apprehended, or is he doing a harmless prank? Were Kitty's cries for help really cries for help, or was she just having an argument with her boyfriend? It's hard for us to tell when we haven't seen the whole event. Moreover, because emergencies are rare, and because we generally tend to assume that events are benign, we may be likely to treat ambiguous cases as not being emergencies. And the problem's compounded when others are present because we're often unsure how to interpret these events, and which leads us to normally look to others to help understand. This is known as informational social influence. However, the people we're looking toward for understanding are themselves unsure how to interpret the situation, and they're looking for us the same way we're looking for them for information about the emergency situation. When we look for others for information, we assume that they know something that we don't. And this is often a mistake because all the people in the situation are doing the exact same thing. None of us really know what to think, but at the same time we assume that the others do know. Pluralistic ignorance occurs when people think that others in their environment have information that they don't have, and when they base their judgments on what they think other people are thinking. So we see here in the figure we have the emergency, then we have notice the event, then we have interpret the event as an emergency, then we have assume responsibility, and then we have no appropriate form of assistance, and then we have intervene. So we see that there's these multiple steps that need to be taken in between the emergency and a person actually intervening for an emergency. Even if we've noticed the emergency and we interpret it as one, this doesn't necessarily mean that we'll come to the rescue of the other person. we still need to decide that it's our responsibility to do something. The problem is that when we see others around us, it's easy to assume that they're going to do something and that we actually don't have to do anything. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when we assume that others will take action and therefore we don't take action ourselves. The irony, of course, is that people are more likely to help when they're the only ones in a situation than when there's others around them. Darley and Latané in 1968 had study participants work on a communication task in which they were sharing ideas about how to best adjust to college life with other people in different rooms using an intercom. According to random assignment to conditions, each participant believed that he or she was communicating with either 1, 2, or 5 other people in 1, 2, or 5 other rooms. Each participant had an initial chance to give his opinions over the intercom, and on the first round, one of the other people, who was actually a Confederate of the experiment, indicated that he had an epileptic-like condition that made the adjustment process very difficult for him. After a few minutes, the subject heard the experimental Confederate say a long, stuttering sentence that was meant to imitate him having a seizure. As you can see here in Table 9.2, effective group size on likelihood and speed of helping, the participants who had thought that they were the only ones about the emergency because they were the only one talking with the person left the room quickly to try to get help. In the larger groups, however, participants were less likely to intervene and slower to respond when they did. Only 31% of the participants in the largest group responded to the end of the 6-minute session. You can see that the social situation has a powerful influence on helping. We simply don't help as much when there's other people around us. So we see here in this table we have, for the group size of 2 people, the participant and the victim, the average helping was 85%. Then we have an average helping time of 52 seconds. Then we have in the group size of 3 people, the participant, the victim, and 1 other. We have an average helping percentage of 62, with an average time in helping of 93 seconds. And then finally we have in the largest group, the participant, the victim, and 4 others, the average helping of 31%, with an average time of 166 seconds. Alright folks, this is going to conclude my second video covering Chapter 9 and Principles of Social Psychology. I hope you guys found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next video.